Welcome to Soul Thrive, where we explore spirituality through healing trauma, shadow work, and applying the laws of the universe in order to master ourselves without the fear of the unknown.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode on the Soul Thrive podcast. And today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and it is going to be about shadow work.
Yes, shadow work. Hi, guys. Hope you're doing well.
I feel like shadow work is really what healing is all about, ultimately.
Yeah, I think that there's a massive push right now energetically that we need to start looking at more of these subconscious parts of ourselves that we have obviously repressed from our childhood experiences, emotions that were deemed as not good or were like bad. Things like, repressed shame, jealousy, greed, envy, like entitlement, operating in certain ways that these subconscious emotions exist within us and then obviously still lead in our lives. But I would also like categorize things like guilt and anger and hatred and just like thinking about like negative emotion. Like when people think to themselves, well, these are bad feelings or these are bad thoughts or these are bad ways of operating. But these are parts of us and these are emotions that exist within us, whether we like it or not. And so most of the time we're leading with this type of energy and we're just not registering that we've developed coping mechanisms around these types of subconscious emotions within the shadow self. So the process of doing shadow work, I think, is really great because it really is about tapping into those aspects of ourselves. The unfortunate part is that most people don't want to face negative emotion. They want to stay in spiritual bypassing, which is like really about focusing on just the positive. And there is such a element where you've got to find the balance between the both, because we don't always want to just stay in that shadow aspect. We want to see and bring light to that area. And from that place, then we can say, okay, you know what? Maybe I'm operating with jealousy. And if I'm operating with jealousy, then I have to acknowledge that something in my childhood created that pattern within me. And now it's become some form of a coping mechanism that I adopt by. So maybe I, compare myself to others, and that's what's leading in a lot of ways due to my jealousy. And because I've got this comparison, or this like idea that somebody else has it more than me or better than me, then there's this aspect of me that just like operates with that jealousy. So by acknowledging that shadow emotion, it gives me the opportunity to then check in with that part of me, the inner child version of me that went through that pattern. And it gives like you the opportunity to really change how you're going to operate with that instead of denying it. Right. Most people are like, I'm not a jealous person. And the defenses come up, right? It's like, we have to get to a point of being able to reflect and take criticism and assess what's really going on. So like, as an example, I can give you guys, like last year was a really hard year, I think in 2024 for a lot of people, but I'll just give you guys my own example. I had a lot of rejection happen within last year, specifically with a couple of people in my life that really made me really check in with my shadow self. I was like, okay, there is something here that I have been avoiding for a very long time. And so I had to sit with these character flaws that I thought I had. And so I had to go into the grief and I had to go into the hatred and I had to go into, all these other shadow parts of myself to really figure out what's happening here. Why did I maybe even attract these experiences and what has shifted within me in the last little while so that I can align with something differently? And then through that, as you move through the shadow, go into the subconscious, you have the opportunity to like really go deep. And then there's like a death and a rebirth that kind of happens with that as well sometimes. So it realigns you. It helps you bring awareness back into your true self. It creates more authenticity. It pulls out other elements of yourself. It shines light in areas that have been dormant and kind of closed off, or maybe you've closed off yourself. And one of the things I think for me that I learned was that I was always operating with this need for safety and protection. And so, having gone through that experience last year, it really provoked the understanding that as long as I'm still operating with the truth of who I am and I'm willing to take accountability for those emotions, whatever that may look like, and I'm willing to explore more of these aspects of my shadow self, then I can still lead with an open heart and still redefine myself as a character. That doesn't mean that just because something bad happens, I can't move through it. And then through that, you learn resiliency, right? You get really resilient towards aspects of yourselves, which I do find two very important parts when you're doing shadow work is a sense of empowerment, like big time, like actual tangible, like changes when you're doing the inner child work and going into the shadow emotions. And then you're developing resiliency. So like you have the ability to say, okay, well, if something's showing up in my life and it's creating chaos, I can move through this effortlessly without defense, without anger, without hatred, because I'm dealing with it.
Yeah.
And I'm also recognizing my own patterns, which then can also go into a sense of relief.
Right. And self-acceptance. I feel like people always talk about, oh, you have to accept all parts of you. Well, this is what you were saying about people not really wanting to do that because they don't want to face certain parts of themselves.
No.
So they reject it. But if you actually face them and say, it's okay, like I do have these negative traits, then you can sort of explore where they come from and give yourself some compassion and then accept that part. And then it's like when you integrate it is when you can shift things in your reality, right?
Yes.
Okay. So many questions
Okay.
though. Okay. So just to sort of like go back to the definition so that people understand. And I know Carl Jung was the one who actually coined this term
100%.
in like therapy, like long time ago. So the shadow self are parts of ourselves that we either don't know, like we are completely unaware of, or there are parts that we, again, subconsciously suppress or deny because they make us feel like we're flawed or like bad people.
Yep.
And so where does that shadow, like those aspects of ourselves that we are unaware of, where does that come from? Because I feel like you always say the universe will always give you experiences by laws of attraction that are in alignment to the shadow self.
Yeah.
Right? So and we'll talk about sort of like that's one of like the steps of like how to recognize the shadow self, because you can even now where you're saying like how you attracted certain experiences last year. So we can look at experiences we attract to be like, okay, this is in alignment to a shadow self. So what am I avoiding here?
Yep.
But where does it, before we go there, like where does this come from?
It comes from your childhood. So basically when you've gone through traumatic experiences in your childhood, and even if you think in some way, in some form that you haven't gone through something traumatic, the way you're operating in your world now, the way you think, the way you perceive your reality, the way that you cope, your triggers, it's all coming from your childhood.
Okay.
And so that leads, whether we like it or not. Now, when we talk about fragmentation, when a child is going through certain experiences that they don't have enough context around, like they're not being educated on, they're not being considered, they're going through trauma and nobody is really there to support them through that process. What happens is like a split in their consciousness happens, like an energetic split. So it fragments, there's fragmentation that occurs. And then these fragmentations start to splinter out into different areas. So like you start to create, like I said, the coping mechanisms, the triggers, the addictive behavior patterns to cope with the fragmentation. So our job as a healer, like my job as a shadow worker, is to go in and figure out where that fragment exists. And I have to go into the inner child, or when I'm doing shadow work, and there's many processes that I work with. It's not just I go in and visit your inner child sometimes. Sometimes it's just a one-on-one conversation that you and I are having. And through that awareness of that part, what people don't register is I'm having a conversation with that fragment or that part. And then I'm bringing awareness to that part and I'm pulling it forward so that it has the opportunity to start looking and examining its experience very differently.
Okay. So for example, and this is something that I think you and I worked on like a few years ago. So for example, if today as an adult you feel like you are too much and like you don't want to be assertive or direct, chances are when you were younger somebody told you that your emotions, your truth, your your feelings were too much. So I
Yeah.
guess in that moment, what's the split? How does the split happen?
So let's say you were a very sensitive kid and you did need more assurance as a kid.
Okay.
And you grew up with a parent or parents in general that were just very busy. They couldn't give you the time of energy that you needed.
Okay.
So what would start to create is first they would continue to reiterate that you're too much.
Like you're being dramatic,
Right.
like
And
whatever.
so there would be a conflict in you that, you have this need that needs to get met and it needs to be nurtured. But now the conflict is that need is bad.
Right.
So so in order for you to start existing in the reality of how your parents created their environment, you need to abandon that part. You need to let go of that part of you
that is vulnerable, that needs
that need to be met. So
Right.
it starts to become a fragment. You're you're cutting that part away from you.
Right.
You're fragmenting that,
And it goes into the shadow.
and it goes
right?
into the shadow. You
Right.
push that away. And so now maybe you start to adapt other ways of looking at it, because you're now looking at they're praising you with, oh, you're so independent. Oh, you're such a good girl. You could do this on your own. And they're giving you this validation from that point of perspective. So you keep abandoning that part of you that needed that nurturement. And then now as an adult woman, you start to create the idea that you're super independent. But the issue with that, though, is if you were to examine your reality by deeming yourself as this hyper independent individual or super independent,
Or super hard and I'm
Yeah,
not emotional
right,
and I don't
right.
need this. Right.
there's a struggle in your relationships.
Right.
Because you're not understanding the underlying need and the underlying emotion that you are sensitive, that you need someone to acknowledge that you need someone to be there for you when you need them, that you need support, right? And
Right.
so on and so forth. And then over time, I mean, there's you got to examine your patterns, because as an adult, you're going to see a pattern in your life and in your experience. So having these patterns, I just had a moment. Sorry, I had a download. That's funny. They kind of gave me why I attracted the pattern that I did last year. So I was like, okay,
Hold that thought.
yeah, remind me. So basically, you've got this part of you that needs this acknowledgement, and it's going to be really hard. Because you could even be going to therapy and they could be saying to you that's great that you're independent. This is a trauma response. I feel like you need to ask support and be vulnerable. You need to tell people what your needs are. But then you're bringing in people who are still saying to you, you're too much.
Right.
Right? I can't handle this. This is too much. Right? And so you're well, I'm trying to put in a different perspective and it's still not working. When we go visit that shadow emotion, if I'm working with you one-on-one, which we have done shadow work before, and I'm okay, let me go into this part of you. And I literally do energetically go to that part of you.
And do you see it when you have a session
Sometimes
with
it
someone?
depends. Sometimes I can see it. Sometimes it also depends on the person too and how they operate and what their energy is. So
Yeah.
I always have to mold into what that person's energies are.
Or what part's showing up, right? Does that ever happen? You have a client and it's
100
no, there's this one part that really wants to be seen.
Well, I think every time someone comes into a session, they're showing up with a part. So even the part of you that thinks
Okay.
is super independent, that's a part of you.
Right.
That's showing
It's
up in
just
that
the
moment.
part that I'm aware of.
Right. And
versus
so
that,
if I'm saying to
Yeah.
you that there's this shadow part of you, this inner child that kept getting, pushed aside and invalidated, and, your emotions weren't being considered in any which way. And I say to you, you've developed this personality now, this part of you
Around
as
it.
a protector.
Yeah.
From that other shadow aspect of yourself that you've repressed. And so now we have to unlock that. We have to bring that to surface. We have to nurture that part of you. It can be a crisis because someone has identified one specific way for such a long time. And now I'm going in and saying, let's bring this new part of you forward. Let's see what this new part of energy can do for you. And it's going to shift everything in your current reality, in your current state, if you're actually doing the work.
Okay.
If you're not, and you do the inner child work and then you regress back to the behavior patterns, you're going to have more conflict. Okay. I mean, there's so many layers to this process when we're talking about shadow work. However, if someone's really not in a state of resistance, And they're like, I've done everything. I'm tired. The pattern keeps showing up. Let's figure this out. Now, here's the thing. A pattern is going to keep showing up because it's part of a life theme.
Right. And the universe, by laws of attraction, will give you that to make you aware.
Right. Because it wants you to move. It wants you to move from, because you came in, and this is where I'm going to get a little esoteric on some people, because you came in with life themes and life patterns, whether you like it or not. You asked for a buffet of experiences. And so here you are. You said you wanted to learn what it would feel like to be in committed, supported relationships. So you were dropped into a family dynamic where you had to learn what it felt like to not get a need met and not to get support. And then so all of that starts to happen with those traumas and those fragmentations and so on. And then you move on with your coping mechanisms, your triggers. And then you're like, but I have this deep desire for committed relationships, or I have this deep desire for connection. Why isn't it happening for me? From a soul level, from an emotional level, from even a physical level, you desire it. But your mental's a whole other story, right? Your mental's going to hijack what every other part of you desires.
So the mental is that protector.
Yes.
Right. So when you split up,
it creates like the mask, right? It creates the ego, creates the mask. It creates other ways of
because
operating.
it doesn't want you to go into the shadow. I feel like
it's
that's
protecting
the biggest,
you from the pain, right? At the end of the day,
because visiting your shadow is painful because it's all
super
these emotions.
Painful.
Right.
It's super painful because you have to acknowledge these parts of you. And then that will then start to shift, move you from that part of you that desired, went through the experience of the trauma. And then as you're working through it and you start identifying the patterns, you start to move on the other spectrum of that, which then means you can move towards relationships that, are supportive, and there is connection, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So in terms of, one of the ways that we can understand the shadow, like say if someone says, okay, I want to start to understand my shadow, you can look at your experiences and the patterns and the cycles that you keep attracting, because that's likely, and there's multiple parts in the shadow.
Yeah, I would say also identify your coping mechanisms, your triggers, your addictive behavior patterns, your void. Void is a big one too. Like a void is something that we all operate within ourselves, and like it will bring in anything and everything just to fill us up, like with a dopamine hit. And
how do you start to do, like, what's one way to do that? Like,
I feel like I have to have a whole conversation just on the void. So we'll do another episode on just the void. Okay. But I want people to understand that, like, the way we operate isn't so clear cut. Like the idea that we operate in one specific way and that this is who I am. And then we have experiences that show up in our lives unexpectedly, because there are like things that do happen to us, and we are a vibrational match to those experiences, and our shadow self is trying to integrate a part of whatever that may be. Anything that happens in our lives is an opportunity for us to learn another shadow part of ourselves.
So we become aware of it. And then we would do inner child work. So going back to
sometimes
the time.
It's not just inner child work. Sometimes it starts off with acknowledging that you do have these behavior patterns. Right. Start there. Like, yes, I am a jealous person. Yes, I am a manipulator. Yes, I am someone who compares myself. Yes, I am someone who's angry. Yes, I am someone, instead of being like, no, everything's okay and I'm great. And what do you mean? I've resolved that. I moved on from it. I did therapy with that, but it's still sitting within you.
And then asking, like, where could that come from?
Yeah. And then identifying and saying, like, where is that coming from? How does this remind me from my childhood? What could I be angry about?
Yeah. And I think the biggest thing that I've learned from doing this work with you is, I think in the beginning it was like, ugh, I'm so like disgusted with this. Like, I can't believe that I have this part. But it's really all about compassion, because what you're saying is like you're being disgusted with your inner child, which is a terrible thing.
Like if you think
angry,
but
like
if you
whatever.
think about that, like if you're operating from like these little versions of yourself, like you're a 2-year-old, like a 2-year-old doesn't understand that they're jealous or that they're that's a bad thing. They just need re-education, and like your part of you needs to be re-educated. That's all it is. But everyone's like, no, don't go there. It's awful and it feels hard. And it's like, but it's the only way that I feel, in my opinion, and through the years that I've been doing this work and working with clients, that it does make change, and you do see change, and you do operate differently, and you do think differently, and you do behave differently if you're genuinely doing the work.
Yeah. And say like how like you can begin the integration obviously by, like you said, like understanding it, doing the inner child work, like working with people such as yourself that can help do that. But then I feel like there's also that aspect of like, yeah, you can be aware of it, but then you still choose the same behaviors and the same thought patterns, or like you don't quite like isn't there like an element of then if you want to attract better, you have to act from a different place?
Yes,
almost.
because you have to understand something. Society today, it like keeps feeding us the idea that as long as we're positive and we're happy people, then we're good. We're part of something. There's some form of normalcy.
Right.
And that's what makes you authentic. And that's not authenticity. Right? Authenticity is about registering, I do have these bad qualities about me. Are you going to be okay with that?
Right.
Like I got, like last year that was used against me.
Okay, so just to go back to that, because you said you
Okay,
got that. You
right.
got that.
So that
what was
download.
the
Okay,
reason
so-
for attracting those? Like, what's the shadow part?
There was always conflict in females in my life. My mom, my grandmother, my aunt, like the women that I should have been looking up to. There were always conflicts, like amongst each other. There was never any resolve. There was always like opinions and thoughts about like how they were operated, like they operated. I felt bad for my mom to a degree because my grandmother wasn't an easy character. My dad's mom, she wasn't an easy character, and my aunt also wasn't an easy character. And so like I love them to pieces, they're my family, but at the end of the day it was very difficult seeing how they were and like assuming like that's just how women operate. But me being a sensitive kid and being like hyper aware and then coming in with the theme of like wanting to help people and wanting to resolve conflict and finding conflict resolve, my whole entire life I've always had conflicts with females.
Okay.
Right. And so I've always attracted like these types of people in my life that love me at one point in time. As long as I'm, giving to them, providing for a need, right?
Yeah.
And like, showing up for them and doing all these things or whatever. However, I'm human. And so I have human responses and I have, ugly parts of me, and like, they're reactive and they're, I can be a bitch sometimes, and I can, like, I do feel like I have a really good heart and I genuinely deeply love people. Like I do, I just don't always show it. And sometimes like I do worry about people's decisions and like the things that they're going to do. And like, I can see the outcomes of certain stuff. So I'm always like trying to help as best as I can, which I've had to put more boundaries up to because like I can't choose for people. And people have to go through their experiences to learn shadow aspects, right? And parts.
Right.
However, I could see how like the twisting would happen. Like my mom would go and like go help my grandmother, and then my grandmother would then turn face and like, she's crazy and she's this and she's that. And it was a lot of avoidant behavior because my dad was creating a lot of behaviors in our environment that he was never held accountable for. And so I grew up in a world, in the environment of like people just get away with shitty behavior, addictive behavior. They're never told that behavior is wrong. It's actually praised for them to go do what they want to go do and pretend that they're living a happy life or whatever that experience is, and nobody speaks up. And the one person who does speak up is deemed crazy, is deemed a problem, is deemed like their flaws are being used against them. And in a lot of ways, even though my mom had mental health issues, the environment she was also in didn't help that. So that's kind of my trauma, right? So like that trauma created the version of me. And then here I am bringing in types of friendships that I want to resolve and fix conflicts and do all these things. But then, when I start to show my shadow parts, like, because I'm someone who's going to show you my good and I'm going to show you my bad.
So what's the shadow part here?
Okay. Well, you know me for a very long time.
Yeah.
What do you deem some of my shadow parts?
Well, you can pop off.
100%.
Right.
100%.
But But you knew that, so why would this
right,
bring? Why would you attract it?
Here's the conversation.
Like you were aware of that.
The difference is that because I was aware of that, because I know this part of me, and because I have an awareness of this part of me,
right?
I'm still going to hold myself accountable for when I do when my shadow behavior comes out,
right?
Or shadow emotions come out. I'm going to hold myself accountable to it.
Okay.
And so, but I'm also going to be vocal in my relationships that I have these parts of me, just like I'm going to accept you have these parts of you.
Right.
Right. The difference is like when we start to become aware that these shadow aspects exist within us, instead of me disowning the fact that, you know what, Ivana, sometimes you play like the victim. Mm-hmm. I'm like, okay, Ivana, you're
crocodile tears.
You're caught in a cycle again. Yeah. Let's work through it. Instead of me being like, oh God, here we go again. Like people don't understand, like, you don't have the right to judge someone because of their shadow part, especially if you know that that's the shadow that they're operating with. Right. And if you genuinely love to be in a relationship with someone, you need to understand that that's their trauma leading.
Yeah.
And instead of it being like an annoyance, a frustration, a problem, deem the person insane or whatever it may be, or toxic, you have to address the issue. I do believe, though, people do not have the right to project their shadows onto other people.
Right.
I don't have the right to project my shadow onto somebody. That's a no. I have to do something about it. I have to educate that part of me. I have to figure out where it's coming from. I need to understand what was triggering me, my coping mechanisms. I got to be with those shadow parts of myself. That's my responsibility.
Right.
Because I don't want to come off as toxic. To myself.
Right.
Not to somebody else, to myself. Because at the end of the day, if I'm going to get angry about something and my anger is going to come out, which is a huge shadow emotion of me popping off and getting reactive, it's because I feel, or I have the perception that I'm unsafe. And that's a big shadow part of me. Like there is something here
that you are unsafe.
Yes. So that I feel unsafe. So the only way that I know how to protect myself is by being an aggressor.
Right. Being angry and
Right.
But here's my question.
Yeah.
But you knew about this part of you before these experiences is what I'm saying. So, or is it just you now have an even bigger awareness of that because of the things that you've attracted?
I knew that I had these parts of me. Did I think that they were going to be used against me? No.
So by laws of attraction, you attracted these experiences last year so that you could further embrace these parts of you and your anger and like...
And forewarn people, like I am someone who can be very reactive, even more so. Like I need you to know that just as much as I'm loving and caring, I'm also this way too. But please note that if I do, it's because I'm triggered in something. I got to identify my trigger and then I'll come back to you and we'll have a conversation about what's really going on. And I'll be honest, since that day when I sat with my shadow emotion, that reactivity within me dissipated.
Yeah, I think it's a lot.
Like,
less.
No, huge, like huge, where I used to like be like, now I ask myself a very important question. Is it worth me dysregulating myself?
Right. Because...
But that part of me, when I visited my inner child, she just wanted to feel safe and regulated. Like, I just want to be in an environment where I'm safe, I'm regulated myself. So I gave her that.
Yeah. It almost feels like, I don't know if we're like a mirror there, but I feel like that shadow part of you is just, it feels unsafe when it doesn't feel understood.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, no, but you have to embrace that.
Well, yeah, because I think my whole entire life, I think witnessing someone, energetically being told, this was my mom being told that she's this character and this person, and then also that being projected onto me, right? Like,
because
you're
oftentimes
this character,
you are very
that
misunderstood.
Person. Very much so.
But I think the difference compared to last year, I would say, is that you don't take it personally anymore because
didn't take it. Listen, I stopped taking things personally. Like I would say 7 years ago. Like 7 years ago, I would say like I really stopped taking a lot of things personally because I understood that trauma leads.
Yeah, and this is about their trauma, not about you.
Right. What I didn't like was being around people who 1 minute were telling me that like you're so important and I love you so much, and then turning face and villainizing me. And I was like, that I had an issue with. I was like, what is happening right now? Like this doesn't coincide with the information that had been told to me for a decade.
Right.
And now all of a sudden I'm a villain to your story, which is bonkers. Like that to me makes me go, it makes me so angry to hear that. My shadow part of me is like angry that is what is the emphasis of who I am as a person, which is insane. Like that's not who I am, right? But
so what would be maybe to end this one on this note? So what would be the work that you would still need to do, or what's the path forward to integration so that you no longer attract something like this?
Listen, with shadow work, I need people to understand that like it is a process that you're in every single day.
Yeah.
So
and not to say that you'll never attract it, but maybe it will affect you less and less and less and less.
Well, it may be different. Maybe I'll attract people who genuinely have integrity.
Right.
Like that just showed me that those types of relationships lacked integrity.
Right. And
so moving forward, integrity is a very important thing, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like if you're telling me who you are, I want to accept you for who you are, but your actions and your words have to line up, mm-hmm. which is a huge part for me.
Right.
Right. But I think what I would like people to understand is that when you're doing this work, you're doing this work for you. You're not doing this work for anybody else. You're doing this because you really are understanding that there are parts of you that you need to figure out about yourself that need your compassion, time, energy, love, acceptance. And from that place, you're going to find a sense of empowerment. Everyone who spoke to me in the last year was like, wow, you were so resilient. Like you kept getting up and you kept doing things. And I was like, yeah, because I do the work. It's a testament to me doing the work. I spend every single moment sitting with myself and being like, okay, that situation and like loss and grief, like it's inevitable. Mm-hmm. We cannot avoid it. We cannot avoid being rejected. We cannot avoid painful emotions. The better we understand them, the better we can sit with them, mm-hmm. the easier it's going to be for us to navigate them and move through them and have the opportunity to then really feel joy in different areas of our lives. And through all of the year that I had last year, 2024, and moving into this year, there were some really great moments too. Mm-hmm. I can't take mm-hmm. away from all the joy and the experiences that have happened as well through moving through all these layers in these experiences. Yeah. That's why I want people to acknowledge more of these parts of themselves.
Yeah. And I feel like, then you have even more understanding and compassion for yourself. And then when you accept it, it's almost like when someone comes to you and says, well, you're like this. And I'm like, yeah, I know.
Right.
So what?
Right.
Okay.
It's so funny.
Thank you for letting me know because I'm aware. Like,
well, it's
fuck
so
you.
funny. It's unaware people. Like, I feel like if someone's listening to this podcast, she'll be like, well, she's kind of mentioned a few times, like last year was a really hard year. Like, it seems like she's not over it. It's like, yeah, I'm not over it because you know what? That was hurtful. What happened last year was hurtful. But parts of me are growing and evolving spiritually because I choose to educate my shadow parts. I do not expect myself to get over something in a year.
Right.
If it takes me 5 years, then it took me 5 years. But in those 5 years, I'm going to sit with every single part of me that shows up, whether that's a thought, whether that's a feeling, whether that's a sensation in my body, whatever, a health problem. All of that is associated with the shadow self. Yeah,
it's funny now that you mentioned a health problem. We didn't talk about the physical symptoms that can also point to shadow aspects, which feels like a whole other topic. Episode.
Well, we'll talk about it with the void.
No, awesome. Thank you. This was good.
I think so. I hope so. And if anyone has any questions, please just DM me or comment below in the reel that we're going to post. But other than that, guys, have a great day. And thanks for tuning in. Bye.
Thank you.